What is it that Will Rogers said about land? Make sure you buy it, because they're not making any more of it. It was certain that the inequality of wealth was not sustainable at that point at all. I mean, that much is for certain.
Henry George was an American writer, politician, and political economist who was the most influential and the proponent of the land value tax, also known as the single tax on land. He inspired the economic philosophy known as Georgism, whose main tenet is that people should own what they create, but not everything found in nature. Most importantly, the value of land belongs equally to all humanity. His most famous work is Progress and Poverty, is a treatise on equality, the cyclic nature of the industrialized economies, and the use of the land value tax as a remedy.
In the time of Henry George, the gap between the rich and the poor was increased greatly, due to some having stock in the booming railroad industry and others not having any. George was a strong critic of railroad and mining interests, corrupt politicians, land speculators, and labor contractors. Furthermore, when he visited New York City, he was struck by the paradox that the poor in long-established cities were much worse off than the poor in less developed areas such as California and the Wild West.
These observations Henry George had when he was on his journey to New York City supplied him with the title for his new book created in 1879, titled Progress and Poverty, which was a great success, selling over 3 million copies. In it, George made the argument that a sizable portion of the wealth created by social and technological advances in a free market economy is possessed by landowners and monopolists via economic rents, and that this concentration of unearned wealth is the main cause of poverty. George considered it a great injustice that private profit was being earned from restricting access to natural resources while productive activity was burdened with heavy taxes, and indicating that such a system was equivalent to slavery, a concept somewhat similar to wage slavery. This is also the work in which he made the case for a land tax, in which governments would tax the value of the land itself, thus preventing private interest from profiting upon its mere possession, but allowing the value of all improvements made to that land to remain with investors.
Oh, hey, I didn't see you there. Huey Price Long was born on August 30th, 1893, nicknamed the Kingfish, as an American politician who served as the 40th governor of Louisiana from 1928 to 1932, and as a member of the United States Senate from 1932 until his assassination in 1935. A Democrat, he was an outspoken populist who denounced the rich and the banks and called for share the wealth. As the political boss of the state, he commanded wide networks of supporters and was willing to take forceful action. He established the political prominence of Long political family.
Long is best known for his Share of Wealth program created in 1934. Under the motto, Every Man a King, it proposed new wealth redistribution measures in the form of a net assessed tax on corporations and individuals to curb the poverty and homelessness endemic nationwide during the Great Depression. To stimulate the economy, Long advocated federal spending on public works, schools, and colleagues, the old age pensions. He was an ardent critic of the policies of the Federal Reserve System.
Under Long's leadership, hospitals and educational institutions were expanded. A system of charity hospitals was set up that provided health care for the poor. Massive highway construction and free bridges brought an end to the rural isolation and free textbooks for school children. He remains a controversial figure in Louisiana history, with critics and supporters debating whether he was a dictator, demagogue, or a populist.
George strongly believed in what we call Georgism, while Huey Long was a strong advocate of the Share Our Wealth program. With Georgism, there will be an annual land-based tax in which properties with large amounts of land and or resources will be taxed heavier than smaller and less valuable land. Huey Long's Share Our Wealth program conducts a tax on annual revenue. Peoples with a larger annual income will be taxed much more than others with smaller annual revenue. Both Henry George and Huey Long conducted taxation that allowed the less wealthy a break with their taxes and the more wealthy would pay more. They just had different strategies in doing
Long
so.
and George shared similar views when it came to socialist ideas of redistributing the wealth in America. Both men were heavily affected by scenes of poverty that they had both witnessed personally, and each used it as motivation to incite a change. George saw railroad companies run rampant over purchased lands and used that to create his theory. Long saw rich investors waste their wealth and cause trouble for lower classes through the stock market crash, and then proceeded to base his ideas on taxing rich people to help out areas doused with poverty.
Huey Long is described as the most colorful as well the most dangerous man to engage American politics, while Henry George was known as a controversial reformer whose book, Progress and Poverty, advocated solving problems of economic equality by tax on land.
In my mind, there is absolutely no doubt that Henry George was more important than Huey Long. I mean, you think of all of Huey Long's ideas, and then you look at Henry George and what he was able to create, and you will find that Huey Long simply did not create but translated Georgism from strictly land-based taxes to income taxes, and also several other socialist ideas, such as equal distribution of wealth and healthcare, to name a few. This should be no surprise, as both belonged to the Democrat Party, and both had up-close and personal views of poverty, but the point still remains that without Henry George, you have no Huey Long. However, you can argue that Huey Long would have achieved more if he hadn't met a tragic, untimely end in 1935, cutting his political career short. Henry George's ideas carried much more weight in not only the United States, but around the world.
Henry George's impact was more important. Henry George's contribution to economics was impressive. His impact on the international reading public was also powerful, and he even affected the political developments of his place and time. Henry George also was an important actor, perhaps even the final one in the field of classic economics. Self-taught and gifted in his written expression, he might have been viewed as the father of classical economics in America. The field at the time featured mostly by British and European figures, but because he was not associated with the American Academy, he was alienated from both by his choice and because it generally rejected his work. Part of the motivation of the study is to make clear why George is not the father of American economics, and his work was so strong among and more gifted than early American economics.
Henry George is the more important of the two. George's influence has ranged widely across the political spectrum. He is claimed as an intellectual influenced by many libertarians and progressives. A large number of famous individuals, both historical and contemporary, claim inspiration from his magnificent ideas. Various political parties around the world were founded on George's ideas. The controversial People's Budget Party was inspired by Henry George. Non-political means have also been attempted to further the cause. A number of single tax colonies were started, such as Arden, Delaware, and Fairhope, Alabama. A recent study in 1977, conducted by Joseph Stiglitz, showed that under certain conditions, spending by the government on public goods will increase aggregate land rents by an equal amount. This result has been dubbed by economists the Henry George theorem, as it characterizes a situation where Henry George's single tax is not only efficient, it also is the only tax necessary to finance public expenditures.
What has destroyed every previous civilization has been the tendency to the unequal distribution of wealth and power.
Dun, dun, dun.